Take two. Forgot to turn my mic on. I just did a 15-minute video, talked all about what I'm going to talk about today, and I forgot to put my mic on. Holy cow. So let's do this again. Be right back. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about full frame cameras and crop sensor cameras, and what's the difference, and why would you want to get one over the other, or if you have one, why would one be better than the other? Okay, so first I'm going to start with APS-C or crop sensor cameras, things like the Canon M50, the Sony A6000, A6500, the Canon T7i, the Nikon Z50, the Nikon D5300. You know, these are all crop sensor cameras, and they all have their own line of lenses that are built specifically for those cameras. They're generally less expensive. They're smaller in some cases, not really with the DSLRs. The Nikon DSLR body still feels like a full frame camera. It's a big camera body. The Canon T series of cameras, they're a little bit smaller, but the 7D Mark II feels like a full frame professional camera, and so does the Nikon D500. It feels like a professional big DSLR camera, which is what it is. Full frame cameras, and I have this is my D750 here, and I have an old D7000 here. So let's see if we look at these. Let's see if it zooms in. You can see the sensor size is a little different. All right, the D750 has a bigger sensor. So what's the difference? Why do I care? Well, let's start with the smaller sensor and the advantages of that. It actually is great for wildlife and sports photography. Typically things that are shot outdoors. I know you can shoot basketball in a gym, but I don't think you're going to be using a really long lens with something like that. But if you get let's say a telephoto lens, and you find yourself always wanting to go a little bit further, or you feel like the things that you're going to want to start shooting are going to be far away, you might say to yourself, oh, I have to get a good camera and this really expensive long lens. But a smaller crop sensor camera might be an advantage for you because the crop factor that's built into it. So for my Nikon, let's just use it as an example, the crop factor is 1.5. So if I'm using a 70 to 200 millimeter lens at the 200 millimeters, which is as long as I can reach with that lens, if I put it on my D7000 here, it now becomes a 300 millimeter lens, because you're effectively, pulling the image in and you're using the whole sensor. So cameras like the Canon 7D Mark II are specifically built for sports and wildlife shooters because it has the smaller sensor, which will give you a longer reach, but it's still a very good camera. Same thing with the Nikon D500. Same principle there. So in that respect, if you're looking for a very telephoto end of your lenses, and that's where you find yourself shooting and you're always wanting more, a crop sensor camera might be the answer for you. Another advantage is the price. They are less expensive than full frame cameras. The Canon M50 that I'm shooting on right here, I have actually the 22 millimeter pancake lens on it. This whole setup right here is about $800. If you use the kit lens, it's $600. Very nice. And I also recently tried out some of the Sigma lenses that they started making for the Canon EOS M, and they are all under $500, and they're all 1.4 aperture lenses, which is typically a very expensive lens to buy, especially if you're buying it for a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. Those lenses are usually well over $1,000 in various focal lengths. So to get that quality of a lens at that aperture is really great, and then you could use it on mirrorless cameras like this. And there are other lenses that they make for the DSLR style crop sensor cameras, like the Canon T7 series or the Nikon D5300 or these types of cameras. And they're very well built, and I was really happy with them. And it made me see that there is definitely another option if I wanted to, if I didn't need a full frame camera. These were just fantastic lenses. So that's an option to look for. You're going to save money when you buy a less expensive camera and use the lenses that are built for it. And the size. The size is another great advantage. Like I was saying, some APS-C size cameras have a DSLR type body, and they're bigger. But there's some that are much smaller, and now the new mirrorless cameras that are coming out, like the M50 here, or the Canon M6, or the Nikon Z50, or the Sony a6000 or the a6500, that line of cameras. They're all small, they're pocketable. So the size is a real advantage, and I love taking my M50 with me, especially when I'm shooting, family stuff and I'm going to be out for the day. I throw it in a pocket, throw it in my wife's purse. It's a little small in my hands. I like the size of a DSLR. I like the way this feels in my hand. It feels sturdy. I don't feel like, it's very comfortable for me. But if you have smaller hands, or you want something that's lighter, or you can't handle something that's heavy, or whatever the issue you may have, these smaller cameras are great for that. So now let's talk about full frame cameras and some of the advantages they have. And I'm going to start with the last thing I just talked about, the size. They are built better. This is a better built camera. It's sturdier, it's weather sealed. I don't mind knocking it around. My M50, I'm a little nervous. It's got a little plasticky feel to it. It's not something I'm comfortable using in the rain. I've shot in pouring rain with my D750 here, and I have no issues with it, never have. Taken it on hikes and dropped it and used it in every conceivable thing you can think of, and it's always performed. It's a heavy-duty, well-built camera. They use less expensive materials, and they're the less expensive cameras, and they're typically, more fragile, and that's something you have to be aware of when you're buying an APS-C size camera. There are exceptions, like I was talking about the Nikon D500, the Canon 7D Mark II. Those are professional level cameras, and they are pretty solid. Another advantage of a full frame camera is it has a little bit shallower depth of field. It's not a huge thing, but it's there. And if you watch our video from last week, if you go back to that one, we compared the Canon R, which is Eric's camera, to his Canon M50. He took the exact same pictures at the exact same settings. And if you look at the images, he reviews them at the end, you can see the depth of field. There's a difference. Now, that's something that you can get around, and it's something you're not going to notice probably if you're not comparing images back to back like that. But just know that it's there. There is a more shallow depth of field on a full frame sensor than there is on a crop sensor. So what that means is if you're shooting at 2.8 like we were on both cameras, more of the background is going to be in focus on the crop sensor, whereas you're going to get a more out of focus, softer background with the full frame sensor. So that's just something to be aware of. It's not a huge deal. But if you shoot portraits a lot, or you do product photography, maybe you want your subject to pop and the background be really out of focus, that's something that you should just be aware of. Okay, and here's the main thing, and the thing for me why I almost always go to my DSLR when it matters. And it's because not only is it reliable and sturdy, and it does have a more professional look if I'm getting paid to do a job, it's the low light performance. And this is something you may not know you need until you need it. So what happens a lot of times is you can't use a flash, or maybe the light is just not where it needs to be, and you have to crank up your ISO. And when you do that, you're degrading the image. And I find that images fall apart a lot quicker when you're using a APS-C size sensor. It's just the way it is. I know there are good ones out there, but I just think apples to apples, you're always going to have better low light performance with a full frame sensor. So here's an example. The other night I was shooting in a restaurant. I was doing product photography for their meals. I was shooting all of the different dishes that they make. I was doing shots of their drinks, the bar. I was doing interior shots of the venue, and doing all these types of images. I couldn't use a flash, and I couldn't bring soft boxes in to use any kind of lighting. So everything had to be natural light. The restaurant was open, and it was right as they were starting to have patrons come in. So this was the situation that I was handed, and they wanted images for their website, for their social media. I had to go in there knowing I had to use natural light. And yes, you can overcome that issue with a tripod, but what if you can't always shoot off the tripod? What if there's a situation where you need to move the camera around, or you just don't have the time? So all these shots that I took inside the restaurant, I'm going to drop some in here so you can see them. These were all shot off the tripod at ISO 100. They are all perfectly clean. They're all HDRs. The lighting was all over the place, so I was able to get some interior shots. But then I had to shoot the food. And I brought the food up to the front of the restaurant and used natural light. And I knew I was going to be holding the camera. I was shooting at different angles, and I put my camera in auto ISO because I'm not worried about the low light performance with this camera. It's got a full frame sensor. It captures a lot of light, and even though I may be shooting at ISO 8000 or 4000, the images are usable, where with the Canon M50 and other crop sensor cameras that I've owned, they start to fall apart after ISO 1000 or 2000. Once you start creeping up there, there's a lot of noise. You lose all the sharpness in the images. You can't edit them as well. You can't bring up the shadows and things. There's a lot of noise there. So these are things that if you're going to be shooting in dark situations, a full frame camera might be the way to go for you. And I know some of my friends that all shoot with full frame mirrorless cameras now, whether it's Eric with the Canon R and some of my other friends that shoot Nikon. These cameras are even better. They just keep getting better and better. The sensors are getting bigger, they capture more light, and these cameras can see in the dark. And the images that you get at these high ISOs are completely usable, and they have very little noise in them. So the technology keeps getting better and better, even for the crop sensors. But if low light performance is what you're looking for, you're going to want a full frame camera. Sporting events in gyms, weddings, indoor parties, like I was doing inside of a restaurant, anywhere where it's going to be dark. That is the real difference between the two sensor sizes. And for me, that's what makes me always want to shoot with a full frame camera when it matters. So I hope that helped you out. Leave some comments. Let me know what you think about this. I'm sure there are some cameras out there that are crop sensor cameras that do a very good job, and they keep getting better and better. But I just think, right now, if I had to go and get paid for a job and I'm working, I'm not ready to give up my full frame camera yet. Even though it's big, it's bulky, it's expensive, the lenses are expensive, you're going to get the absolute best image possible using a full frame camera. Okay, so that's just my opinion there, and just from using the two different types of cameras. I'm going to leave the video we did last week where we compare the Canon R to the M50, and you'll see what we were talking about when the images are compared side by side. We do a little shooting together, and then Eric goes into the computer and looks at them. And then here I'm going to leave my review of the Sigma 56mm that I did. I took it on a cruise with me, and there's sample images in there, so you can see what a inexpensive, purpose-built for the a crop sensor camera, the kind of images you can get out of it. Okay, see you in the next video.